of different languages program for today. And let's start with Laurette about Zulu resource grammar.
Thank you very much. Let me quickly get my screen sharing sorted again. Wait a second. The slides I want to share with you. Oops. Right. Okay. Now, wait a second. Sorry. Okay. Thanks very much, Inari. So I will be presenting this talk on behalf of me and my mother and colleague, Laurette Pretorius. And we are very privileged to work on this Zulu resource grammar with Professor Lionel Posthumus, who is one of the top Zulu linguists in South Africa. Okay, so my talk will have the following outline. I'll say some things about Zulu and its resources, and then I will very briefly discuss its most characteristic features as a Bantu language. These are, it has an agglutinating morphology, as a nominal classification system. That means that all the noun stems belong to one or more noun classes. Agreement in Zulu is based on these noun classes, and the morphemes responsible for indicating agreement are commonly called concords. So Lionel, our Zulu expert, prefers not to call them that because it is a somewhat overused term. Everything ends up being a concord. However, I think I might probably call them that still because it is a widely used term, so not to confuse people. And then the meat of the tour will be a kind of, the meat of the talk will be a kind of tour of the Zulu resource grammar, but I'll focus mainly on the noun phrase. So some orientating facts about Zulu. It belongs to the Nguni group of languages, which is part of the Southern Bantu group. And of course, this is part of the Bantu language family. One of 11 official languages of South Africa, spoken by about 11.5 million people as a home language and understood by about half of South Africans. And then it's the second most widely spoken Bantu language after Swahili, according to Wikipedia. And it has a Wikipedia, not exactly 10,000 articles, but like I said yesterday, most of them are single sentences. So that's kind of an indication of its digital presence. In terms of NLP resources, I think the most relevant one for our purposes has been the morphological analyzer that my mother and Zonja Bosch has developed. Then the latter is also involved in the current WordNet project. So there is an existing Zulu WordNet that I think she was also involved with Zonja, but they're working on new ones. There are some corpora for Zulu. There's a monolingual corpus, the largest one that I'm available of that's been curated. There's a 1.5 million sentences, more or less. Some parallel corpora that I mentioned yesterday. Then there's isiZulu.net, which is not really an NLP resource, but it's an online dictionary and it's really very good. It's got a lot of morphological information and so on. So I actually end up using it quite a lot. And then of course, there's the resource grammar work in progress. So, and the code is also available. At some point, I tried to fork from GitHub, and then I couldn't do two different forks of the same project, and I already had one for the Afrikaans. So now there's a copy, but we'll sort that out in due course. Right, so Zulu, agglutinating morphology, and it has a conjunctive orthography. This distinguishes it from other related Southern Bantu languages with a disjunctive orthography, which basically means that verb prefixes tend to be written as separate tokens. But in Zulu, verb prefixes are written as part of the verb token. Depending on how you count, there are 18 different noun classes. And this feature has also been called class gender by some linguists. And we found that to be a useful term because it does actually behave a lot like gender in other languages. In fact, there's not much of a difference between those two concepts, except maybe the number of classes. So nouns agree with all sorts of things around them: verbs, copulatives, relative clauses, adjectives, demonstratives, etc. And just a little example to give you a taste of that. So in this example, the Noun prefix u for Tatiana, she's a person, so she's in the class 1A. So that's a class 1A noun. And the subject concord for that class is the prefix in the verb uzozuza. And then Indonda is middle, it's a class noun, class 9 noun. And so the possessive concord that goes in front of Igolide is ya. And there we also have an example of morpheme fusion. So the ya possessive concord and the Igolide, the e of the noun prefix there, they fuse into a ye. And so basically what happens there in GF, if you want to do this, you need to have allomorphs and you need to use the bind operator. Because if you try to do this in the traditional morphology way, you would end up with hundreds of forms of the noun, of each noun. And so the grammar becomes enormous, even if you have a very small toy grammar. So we treat, this isn't a new thought. This has been done. I think this is how the other Bantu languages are also kind of approached. We treat the morphology as though it is syntax, and we let the runtime know that it has to bind these tokens together using that bind token. Quick view of the noun classes. Those are the 18. I honestly don't really know why there is no class 12 and 13. Maybe Laurette knows. I don't know. Anyways, so those are the 18. There's a class 1, 2 and a class 1A, 2A. And these classes have kind of typical content. So there are some themes with regards to the semantics of the classes. For example, class 1 and 2 are persons. So that would be, the noun person. And then class 1A, 2A is very closely related. They share the same concords, but they have different class prefixes, and those are used for proper names and titles and so on. So each class is associated with a prefix, and in fact, it's the prefix that tells you what class the noun belongs to. And usually, most nouns belong to two classes: one for its plural and one for its singular, one for its plural. And just a quick view of how the concordal agreement would work. Predicates always contain a subject concord, while the use of the object concord is a bit more fluid. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it isn't. And both the subject and the object concord can stand in for noun phrases. So you can have bro drop on both the subject and the object noun phrase. And then what I want to say about the last line of the table is that they are called the locative classes. Oh, I actually want to mention class 15 as well. Those are the infinitives. So you can basically take any verb root and use it, suffix verb terminative a. So harm becomes hamba, that's a stem. And then you can use the class 15 noun prefix, and basically you have a kind of a gerund or an infinitive to work with. The locatives, only class 17 really behaves like a noun. So class 16 and 18 have more adverbial use. So that's why I've kind of highlighted 17. So wherever we have tables with concords, it's class 17 that's featured. And an interesting thing is that some of the noun root or noun stems can belong to more than two classes. So for instance, two means person. So in the class, if you prefix it with a class 1 or 2 prefix, it's person or people. Class 7 often indicates collectives. So if you put that prefix in front, you get something like mankind. And class 14 is for abstract concepts. So then you get humanity. And interestingly enough, the Zulu noun stem basically has the meaning of heaven, the heavens. So depending on what prefix you give it, you either get the Zulu, a Zulu person or people, someone from the Zulu clan, so Mr. Zulu. Interestingly, these class 1A, 2A nouns that are actually can be proper names can also occur in the plural. So you have something like Mr. Zulu and company. And so the isiZulu is the language, it's culture, so again, the collective. And then interestingly, the locative prefix pa can be prefixed to iZulu, and then you get the locative noun above. Okay, basic morphosyntax. So here we have an example of a clause rendered in some of the basic tenses in the principal indicative mood. And then there's some variation in the polarity as well. I've added colors to show where morphemes have been bound together at runtime. So underlying these colored morphemes, they are actually underlying, they are separate tokens that are fused together or stuck together by the bind token. So the green is the subject concord in each case. It always has to be there. It's different in 2 spots, and that is or actually three spots. But so for the one example is the remote past. The kind of the lemmatized version of that morpheme is still oo, but it undergoes a phonological change in the presence of the tense prefix a. So then it becomes a w, wazuza. And the negative subject concord for that same class, for the class 1A class, is ka. So there's it entirely different. And we treat all these little green strings as allomorphs of each other. Red is the tense prefix. It can be a in the remote past, or zo or zu in the immediate future, depending on the polarity. A slight remnant of the miniature resource grammar is that we haven't actually implemented the remote future yet, but I think it would then be yo or you instead of zo or zu. And then the negative prefix a can be seen in the 2 negative sentences. And note that in the remote past, you actually have to use a different suffix, namely anga, on the verb root. So, and then there's also no explicit tense prefix there. Okay, that was a very quick and dirty introduction to how Zulu verbs work. I grabbed this from the GF website, and unless I'm mistaken, I think it's a bit outdated, but it still does a decent job of giving an overview of the different categories in the resource grammar. And today I'll basically be spending most of the time in the bottom left corner talking about the noun phrase. I've made a slightly edited version of that part of the graph, and I've assigned some colors. So black means that we're basically happy with the linearization category of that category, and we've dealt with the most important functions needed to construct it. Orange means that we've done some significant work on the category, but we still have some ironing out to do. The red means that it has not been implemented yet, and to be honest, I still need to figure out how to do those list categories. I haven't, somehow I haven't made them work yet. So, and then I guess the most controversial color here is the cyan. That means that the category itself is currently on ice. That doesn't mean that we don't plan to implement it at all, but it does mean that we either have no idea how to make it work for Zulu at the moment, or we know that Zulu uses other categories and constructions to achieve basically the same effect. So as we go along, it will become clear that we are taking a few liberties with the resource grammar abstract syntax. There are 3 main reasons for this. So first, the Zulu grammar has a tendency to blow up. We need to keep it compilable at all times. So we're only implementing things that we're reasonably sure about. And by that, I mean, it's just that we can't wait half an hour for the res or the sentence modules to compile whenever we make some changes. It just gets very slow. It slows down our work. So we try to, that's one of the reasons why we don't implement things at the moment. Also, it takes a lot of RAM, and we don't have that much RAM. So that's one thing. Second thing is that Zulu linguistics has never been studied with such a strong focus on fitting in with a kind of universal conception of grammar. So we're doing a lot of figuring out as we go along. We have to sort out form and function, and often it's 2 steps forward and at least 1 step back. And this also means that we can't optimize too early, because then backtracking becomes very hairy. So at the moment, we try to keep the code as self-documenting and basically reflective of the linguistics as far as possible. And so that means we kind of may have to make some non-optimal choices now. So that means basically that we want to wait before implementing things that seem redundant at the moment. So ultimately, our goal is to produce something useful. So on the one hand, it has to be a recognizable implementation of Zulu, but we also want to participate basically in the multilingual advantages of the resource grammar and the resource grammar library and so on. So with that said, I'll be talking about a few of the categories in this graph, noun and common noun first. Then we'll talk about adjectives. You'll notice that the adjective node, I've changed the shape because adjectives in Zulu are in fact not an open class, they're a closed class. We'll get to that. I'll look at determination. And so because ordinals are a bit odd in Zulu, you can't just say the best, you have to say better than all the others of some kind. So you have to specify your ordinals in a different way, and we're not sure how to do that yet. Cardinals don't behave as a coherent morphosyntax category. So, and we can actually do a lot of, well, we can model the cardinals using all the other things that we've implemented. So for now, we've left those out. That basically leaves us with singular and plural. I'll talk a bit about quantifiers, and we'll talk about pronouns and pre and post determiners as well. So, and then I'll touch on some verb stuff later on. All right, so here we have a kind of a snapshot of the linkats for nouns and common nouns. We need to look at the relevant parameters. So the class gender parameter groups the nouns into where they belong. So we have those parameters. Each noun then is associated with only one class gender value. And well, actually, I should say each noun sense. So we would have 2 belonging to class 1, 2, as well as to 7, 8, and 15. No, yes, 14. So that would basically mean 3 different senses, 3 different functions in the lexicon. We need 4. We need a parameter with 4 values for the noun form: full, reduced, possessive, and locative. The full form includes the class prefix. The reduced form includes the class prefix. Basically, it's the full form minus a leading vowel. The possessive form for nouns is exactly the same as the reduced form, but not for pronouns. And because we keep this parameter up to the noun phrase level, we need to reuse the same parameter for pronouns. And then the loc is the locative. And so here we implement there's a default locative form, which is usually an a prefix and an ini suffix. And we have a bunch of nice paradigms that sort out phonological changes that happen in the noun, inside the noun. So for the nouns, we try to pre-render as many of the tokens as possible, but we have the reduced and the possessive to bind to other morphemes at runtime. Our agreement parameter is relatively straightforward. It uses person as a constructor, and it has class gender in the third person, and then obviously we get number from the param-x module. We have a table for nouns from number to n-form to string, and it's almost the same for common nouns, except that we have to split the modifier string. And this isn't entirely, I'm not sure if this is the best way to do it, but at the moment we need to do that. Here's an example. So indondo is medal, le ndondo is this medal. Then you can say this very medal. So then you use the pronoun associated with the noun as an emphatic for emphasis. You can also say this medal on the other hand, so then the pronoun goes after the noun. And then obviously you can modify a common noun. So then inkulu means big, so lendondo inkulu. But if you want to say this big medal on the other hand, turns out that yona, the pronoun, has to be inserted inside the inkulu. So what is interesting here is that this pronoun that you put in front or behind is not modification as such, and it's also not immediately clear at what level it should operate. Like, is it a function on the common noun, since it gets inserted before the adjective for contrast, or is it a function of the noun phrase, which is why it's inserted before the quantifier for emphasis? So linguists consider this to be one phenomenon, but maybe it makes sense to deal with emphasis and contrast as two different things in this GF grammar. We're not sure yet, and we'll talk about this again later, but this is a typical question that pops up all the time. Now we get to adjectives. So in Zulu, they are a closed class, like I've said, and there are three kinds of stems that behave almost the same way. So we've kind of put them all in the A category. These are adjective stems, primitive relative stems, and enumerative stems. And they all, so what they share in common is that they only take a concord for the agreement with a noun, but they take different concords. So we deal with this using two different parameters. We need a parameter that allows us to choose the correct agreement morpheme for the different kinds of adjectives. That's A type. But we also need an A form parameter to deal with the sound changes that happens in adjective stems, depending on which nouns they modify. So there's an example of Kulu, which means big. And you can see that it changes in the second form. Here are some more examples. So Schle means beautiful. It's like Kulu. It's an adjective stem, so I would say a real adjective. But it's also monosyllabic, and that means that this is actually an example of an adjective where you need all three different forms of the noun stem in order to stick it onto the agreement morpheme correctly. And then, but this is not the case for the primitive relative stems and the enumerative stems, of which there are one or two, to be honest. They don't have these sound changes, so the table just maps to the same string. And we can see how that works for Schle. So if you modify pool, you need to use AF1. If you modify middle, that's class 9, so you have a nasal, so you have to insert that N. And if you modify a class 1, 2, yes, that's right. 1, 2, 1A, no, 1A and 3. Sorry, these classes, so the singular and plural can actually differ. So it's 1, 1A and 3. That you need to use it for one class, and form 2 is used for 8, which is a plural, 9, which is a singular, and 10, which is a plural. Okay, quantifiers. So we've implemented the following quantifiers. We have an indefinite article and definite article. That's been done. We have this quant and that quant. But then Zulu also has a yonder quant, a kind of a third distance for these quantifiers. So we have parameters to deal with this underlying structure. QuantDef pulls them all together, so it's either an article with definiteness associated with it or a demonstrative with distance associated with it. And we have a table in the res module called dempron, which lists all the demonstratives for all the classes at the different distances. And so how does this work? The quant itself has a string, but that's usually empty at the moment. The more important piece is the QDef parameter that has the quantDef in it. And that basically, it does two things. It determines the form of the determiner. So you choose from the dempron table, or you choose to not, you choose the empty string of the article. But it also influences the form of the noun. So you have indondo, a or the medal that gleams. This medal, then you have to choose the reduced form of the noun. So le is a distance 1 demonstrative, leyo is distance 2, leya is distance 3, and in all those cases you choose a different form of the noun. We didn't implement no quant for the following reason, and I think I'm just highlighting this because it's rather typical. There is no quant in Zulu. You have to paraphrase and rather drastically add that. So instead of no medal gleams, you would say there is no medal that gleams, or more literally, it is not with a medal that gleams. So that's an entirely different sentence. It has its own morphosyntactic realities. Implementing that as a paraphrase in all its glory seems to be a bit heavy-handed, especially if we can express this using different functions. And in fact, we don't even need the existential functions in the extra module of the resource grammar. We literally just use very standard stuff. So that's why we just dropped no quant, because it doesn't add much and it seems to complicate things quite a bit. I won't say much about the pront category. I just wanted to show that here this is why we have a different reduced and a possessive form in the N form, because, for example, the second singular pronoun has a different possessive form than its reduced form. And we have an empty field, and this is for dealing with prodrop, so that we don't generate meta variables all over the place. There's more to say about this, but I think I don't want to get too technical. Okay, some pre and post determiners. So we chose to use the pre-det category to basically implement the exclusive and inclusive quantitative pronouns. So that's only and all. And all can actually appear before or after the noun phrase. So we have an all and an all pre-det. And a Boolean that says where it should come, basically. But at this point, we kind of have to deal with the emphasis and the contrast as well, and trying to figure out what is what. So I have a few sentences that show where these things go. So we've got Izinhlambi zonke zinklintizane. And that means all the swimmers competed, and the zonke is after the swimmers. It could have stood in front, but either way. Then the dwa, the yedwa of Utatyana yedwa, that can only go afterwards, so it's a post determiner of some kind. Only Tatyana swam very well. And then that same Tatyana, so yena Utatyana, that's where we use that pronoun again. It is in front of the noun phrase, and then in order to contrast that, we can say Izinhlambi zona. The other swimmers, on the other hand, so the Zimbe is, that's another example of where the zona is inserted in between the swimmers and the modifier other. And that Zimbe is an enumerative stem. So, okay, what does this mean? I've said a bit about what we didn't implement. I should say something about what we have implemented and why we still have a relatively useful grammar. So a lot of determination or quantification or modification in Zulu actually rests on only two functions, namely pos MP, possessive, where you modify a common noun with a noun phrase in a possessive construction, and the rel cn, so where you basically have a relative clause that modifies your common noun. So if we want to say most swimmers in English, we use the most pre-det, and you have swimmers. That's very simple. Indefinite article, plural, and then the noun for swimmer. Most pre-det, as no quant doesn't really exist in Zulu, what you would need to do is you would have to say the majority of swimmers, and then you use the possessive construction. So this is an example of where instead of some kind of determination, you actually have modification in a different way. And since we have the possessive, the pos MP function, this is very easy to deal with. If you have the right lexical items in your lexicon. And then a huge amount of work that adjectives do in other languages is actually done by verbs in Zulu, and specifically stative and inchoative verbs. So stative verbs are verbs that describe being in some state, and inchoative verbs describe entering into some kind of state. And often you can derive one from the other with the root changing a little bit. this is still kind of an open thing that we're trying to figure out. We have the mechanics to deal with this, but obviously the whole being and becoming interacts in a relatively interesting way with tense. And so that's one of the reasons why the relative clause category and the relative sentence categories are orange at the moment and not black in that graph that I've shown. Because we need to figure out how this relates to modification. At the moment, at least, we can express it. We're just not sure if it's a good idea to have something in the present tense or the perfect tense when actually what you mean. So if you want to say the swimmer, the tired swimmer, what you really have is the swimmer that has become tired. And basically, we just need to figure out a nice way of dealing with that so that it makes sense to someone looking at the tree, someone with some Zulu knowledge, that they can recognize that this tree does actually represent what's happening underneath. But we also want to kind of fit it into the resource grammar abstract syntax tense system in some way. And this is actually a large part of what we have to still do. So now we can actually come to the LINCAT of the noun phrase. It's still, so we're basically happy with that it does what it should do, but hopefully we can optimize this a little bit, because you can see we have quite a few string fields, and this is because we're still trying to sort out the word order, trying to make sure that everything that, on the one hand, we generate good Zulu from trees that make sense. So yes, and then one other thing that I want to mention is that this quantdef, the reason we don't just add the demonstratives, for instance, directly to the noun phrase is because the quantdef parameter has some more work to do even after you've added the determiner or the quantifier, because it also influences the form of the noun depending on the larger syntactic context that the noun is used in. So if you say ngiyabonga lendondo, I see this medal. And if you put that in the negative, it's relatively simple. Angiboni lendondo, I don't see this medal. Then you can also say ngiyabona indondo, and that can mean I see a or the middle. The definiteness doesn't really enter into this question. It could be either way. But there is one place where you can actually distinguish between the definiteness of the article, and that is in the negative object noun phrase. So if you want to say, I don't see the medal, you use the full noun, indondo. And if you want to see, I don't see a medal, you use the less definite form actually of the noun, just ndondo. What it literally comes down to is something like, I don't see anything medal-like. So that ndondo has that kind of sense. I don't see anything medal-like. And so we've kind of implemented that as, or interpreted that as the indefinite article being kind of functioning there. And what this also happens to mean is that the complement field in the verb phrase depends, its form depends on the polarity of the string. So this is, I don't think this happens very often in resource grammars, I don't know, but it does make everything quite involved, and it seems like you can't make many decisions about the strings that you're dealing with until you know a lot about the sentence in which they appear. So something that I want to say about noun phrases and trying to do useful paraphrases. So in the sentence, I saw all those big stadiums. You have ngibone, I saw. Zonke is all, lazy is those. And then you have zinkundla, which is stadiums, and ezinkulu, which is big. So it's very similar to the English noun phrase, except that the adjective comes after the noun. That's not a problem. It's relatively simple. But then you want to say, I went to all those stadiums. So you change the verb to ngiye. And so we know ngiye ezinkundleni. So there you use the locative to indicate to the stadiums. That's ezinkundleni. And so in order to use this more complex noun phrase, we have to do a paraphrase because the zonke lezi shouldn't come in front of the locative. But it turns out it's not a big problem because actually the demonstratives and zonke specifically can appear after the noun. So we can maybe decide that, okay, so the demonstratives, it basically swaps around. So lezi zonke ezinkulu. And with much anticipation, we showed this to Lionel, and you can't do that. In order to express that meaning, I went to all those stadiums. What you have to say is, I went to them, kuzo, which is a locative, and then appositionally, all those big stadiums. So I went to them, all those big stadiums. And this is basically just an example of the kind of stuff that we run into all the time. And we have to decide, so do we implement this supposedly reasonable paraphrase at this point, or do we do something is very unreasonable in order to indicate that the tree that you tried to linearize was actually not useful? I don't know. If you wanted to, oh, there's my tree. That's the tree that you would need to express this kuzo zonke lezi ezinkundla. And we don't want to implement that as a paraphrase because, like I've said before, it has its own morphosyntactic realities. So then you kind of start implementing things inside other things and it becomes rather ugly. So at the moment, we're letting the grammar overgenerate that red sentence. We don't know if this is the best way of doing it, but yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment. I want to say something about the locatives now. So a locative can be a specific form of a regular noun, or it can be nouns in certain noun classes, as I spoke about earlier. So in order generally to express the notion of to or towards something, you would have a prep MP, a preposition to, and then whatever you want to go towards. So that's where we would start looking for something. But interestingly, if you wanted to say kuze zonke lezi zinkundla ezinkulu, that could mean to them, but it could also mean in them, on them, or below them. And in fact, the kind of unmarked locative in Zulu doesn't distinguish between all of this. You could distinguish by using these locative nouns, pakati, phezulu, phansi, which literally means inside, on top, below. But it's very marked then specifically. So so instead of prep MP, what we do have are some new functions for Zulu and possibly for Bantu. So the locative MP makes an adverb of the noun by just choosing the locative version of the noun from the noun phrase. You can use qua, so that would be, you can only use it with a person, so only a specific class makes any sense, but that means at her place. So we're going to her place instead of to her. You can have an instrumental ga, so that basically replaces the with preposition. And then you can also have these adverbs along with a qua noun phrase. So on top of the podium, you would actually have to use phezulu, drop the lu at the end, put the nga, which is an adverbial prefix, and then you can use the noun for stage, but you prefix that with a qua. So this is also stuff that we're kind of happy with the morphology of this, but we have to figure out whether this captures everything that needs to be captured. It's always rather hectic having to divert from the resource grammar abstract syntax, because you kind of feel like now you're on your own. Hopefully it works, hopefully it doesn't. But anyways, okay, so there's the above adverb that we can use for this. Okay. I think I've said a lot about the noun, so I want to quickly talk about the verb morphology. This is just like a very quick overview. Some of them important parameters for how we do the verb morphology. So we have R form, which basically is the root of the verb with its relevant suffix. And so we've kind of identified the regular suffixes, and this can change for the stative and the inchoative verbs, but these parameters represent the way these roots are used in a general way. We need a parameter to help us remember what sound the root starts with in order for it to choose the correct forms of the prefixes. So that's either any of the vowels or a consonant. We have to remember whether it's monosyllabic or multisyllabic, and we have the active and passive voice parameter, but honestly, we've stopped using that. So I think maybe we can drop that, but I haven't dropped it yet, just because we're not entirely sure yet. So, and we have some parameters to, some paradigms to deal with this. They can't necessarily be smart because this doesn't depend on matching on the root, but we have different paradigms for some different verbs. So bona is a regular verb. It behaves itself very well. So we would typically have 5 different versions of the noun, the verb root with its suffix. And then the T verb is a bit of a exception. It doesn't have an R form. The default root suffix is E. So we have a paradigm to deal with that. And I just want to say a very quick word about the current parameters that we use to deal with the verb. So we at the moment distinguish between dependent moods, principal and participial. The principal is typically used in main clauses, and the participial is used in subjunctive clauses like relative clauses. We have a parameter for aspect, and it has been implemented, although dealing with aspect on a syntax level is we're not entirely sure how to do that yet. But it is there for when we need to use it. We have 4 basic tenses. Like I mentioned earlier, we should probably add the, their names. These names are controversial as well. So we have the perf tense. It was taken out of the miniature resource grammar. Actually, I have to say that at the moment, we entirely ignore the resource grammar abstract syntax tense system. We're just still figuring out just how the Zulu works. And once we have a good handle on that, we'll try and figure out how we need to align those. So from the miniature resource grammar, we implemented these 4 tenses, and the immediate past is often called the perfect tense. So that's why it's still perfect tense here. So we have the immediate past or perfect tense, we have the past tense, which we use as the remote tense, we have the present tense, future tense, which is the immediate future, and then we'll need the remote future as well at some point. But then Zulu doesn't only have the basic tenses, it has relative tenses. So you can basically combine the basic tenses in different ways. And so we have a parameter to deal with that. And that has been implemented to some extent, but there's still quite a bit of work to do to iron out how that works and so on. And so our V-form parameter, the version that we're, or at least the part that we're most happy about, is the indicative mood. And it can be in one of the 2 dependent moods. It depends on polarity. You can choose any of the basic tenses and one of the aspects. And then we also have potential and subjunctive as entirely different independent moods. But we still have to basically, the linguists don't always agree on what counts as mood versus aspect and so on. So part of figuring this out is trying to navigate the existing linguistic research, basically. And then very important, what we do need is a parameter to help us know what the type of the verb phrase is, how it was constructed, because that basically informs the kind of morpheme sequence that the predicate would have. So we have copulative, identifying copulative, associative copulative, we have descriptive copulative. The associative copulative is different. I don't think there's something in the resource grammar abstract syntax that does that. It means you are with something. So you are with blood if you are bleeding, for example. And then we need to know what the complement is like, because that also has an effect on the morpheme sequence that you choose. So our pred VP, you can see on the right there, has different strategies depending on what the type of the verb phrase is. And unsurprisingly, this is a major bottleneck in the grammar. So that's the function that takes several minutes to compile. I think it can take up to 15 minutes at the moment, and that's despite our best efforts to keep it small. And then we have some operators that kind of use these parameters to choose form. So if we have akazuzuza, if I remember correctly, that is the future negative. And it's for class 1 or 1A. So we choose R form based on V form. That means that we just use the first version of the noun root, of the verb root. And we can choose tense prefix, the negative prefix, and there are two negatives. There are actually two slots for negative prefixes, and you have to know which one to choose for the second. Okay, so we have a prefix nga and a prefix nge. And then obviously there's a slot for the subject concord, so we use V form to choose that as well. And although we don't have an object concord in this example, we also need to know some things. That's where we actually use the syllable parameter to know what form the object concord should take. Right, so to conclude, the noun phrase is nearing completion. And the next thing that we have to do is we have to revamp temp. So the tense, aspect, mood, polarity, we have to sort that out. The kind of challenges that we deal with is if we ask our Zulu expert, our linguist, like, if it's wrong, how wrong is it? And I think that's where it gets a bit interesting, because maybe it's to do with a number of people who've studied Zulu, or the I don't know, the maturity of the research given the small pool of linguists who work on this, but it isn't as simple as saying, oh, this is syntactically fine, but it's semantically nonsense. Like, there's the line between those two isn't always obvious. And so just as we go along, we need to deal with ambiguity in the grammar, and choosing often between ambiguity and overgeneration of wrong Zulu. And what I also have to say at this point is the whole syntax as morphology thing means that it's rather risky strategy, because it does mean that you run the risk of generating tokens that are wrong. So it's one thing to have a sentence that puts real English words in a wrong order. It's a bit different having wrong Zulu words, so morphemes that shouldn't go together, ending up together in tokens. And so I think it's a more risky strategy in that sense. And then obviously we need to keep compiling our grammar, so we have to make choices about efficiency. Stuff that we hope to work on in the not too distant future is a multilingual lexicon. So we have a really nice monolingual lexicon of roots and things, but it's just for Zulu at the moment. And we want to see if we can kind of contribute to GF WordNet. We have some plans for that, and we want to work on the chunk-like parsing. So one of the things when you have these linkats that are made up of, half made up at any given point, parsing chunks is a bit more complicated. So we want to work on that. Thanks. I think that's everything I thought of saying. So thank you very much for listening. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Lorette. I typed like a whole monologue on the chat, but like,
sorry.
I'll say them if like, no, others, please start with your questions. Like okay, Arne, go on.
Thank you. You have a real challenge and you take it really seriously. So it's really fascinating. So I have again, some questions, so I can give the first two, so which are rather general. So the first one is that, did you try, when you are just experimenting with the grammar, compile with the no PMCFG flag, then it goes fast? And
yes, we have done that, but what I haven't figured out yet, maybe this I should have spent more time on this, is we need, so I send everything to a server, compile it on the server, and then I need to get it back somehow. And I tried to do that, but the object, the GFO files, I always seem to re-trigger compilation on my own machine, and my local machine, I don't have enough RAM. So I've been using the PMCFG just as a means of getting the grammar locally, and not spending time on the server working. So it's we should have probably tried harder to get that working, but we haven't yet.
Yeah, well, that's just a small technical thing. Another thing which is kind of more a community question is, so all this activity with Bantu grammars in Kenya and Uganda with Benson and Wanjiku and David and those, and they are working with some Bantu functor, and I don't know if it is really extensible to the South Bantu languages, or have you been looking at that?
We haven't. We've looked at it. So, but one of the things that we found is, I think we are in some way under a bit of pressure to build something that's useful for Zulu. And we have to be able to show that it's useful for Zulu. And so that kind of, maybe I'm thinking wrongly about this, but adding that layer of abstraction on top of something that you don't understand that well yet seemed like it might not help at this point. But maybe we can do a kind of a merge later on. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely understand this. So it's maybe it must be left to future work then. But yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Just a quick comment. Like, I wonder if the starting point of David and Benson is something to use in application, because I understand that the Zulu grammar was like the whole starting point was that it's going to be used in application, and then you added stuff that makes sense to have, like how to parse actual sentences. Whereas I don't know if David and Benson have just started from, well, okay, we have a function called prep MP, so let's fill that, done, next. So that's my suspicion, that like I see that you have, like, out of necessity, you have added a lot of stuff from, like, that is not in the common core. So that would be in extend or extra. Like,
yes.
Yes. So we are trying to thread that needle. So on the one hand, we do kind of go between, okay, we have this function, how should we implement it for Zulu? And on the other hand, you look at a book and it says there's a locative and you can use it in this way, and then you just write a function that does that. So it's actually, we're finding it quite challenging to find the balance between those two. And you're right, the pressure to actually have something that works earlier has definitely made a difference in how we approach this.
Actually, this is a question to Arne or other people. But I was thinking, like, is it possible, even like technically possible, to override the syntax, like the RGL API? So, like, let's say that usually like syntax, eng syntax, whatever, is just like, it's just instantiation. But could we make like syntax Zulu, where, for instance, if you use the, like, let's say, have v2, and that would somehow map into associative copula or something like that. Is that technically possible? And would it be useful? Like,
yes, I think it would be. So this has not been done. I mean, in the RGL/API/constructors or something like that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You could yes, I think you could certainly do that.
Actually, I did do something like that. it was a bit of a, I don't know if it was how much of a hack it was at the time, but in order to build application grammars, it just was a bit much easier. So I did kind of implement a little layer. I called it Nguni syntax, kind of, because I also had a Corsa mini resource grammar that I wanted to bootstrap. So I don't know if this is exactly what you're talking about, but I have done something similar.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, that sounds to me like the excellent like compromise between that you're extending the RGL abstract syntax, but you're still actually porting that into the RGL API, because these are two different things. So I think that's great. I had no idea you had done it. Sorry, like I'm just ignorant because I didn't know myself. So like that was just.
I'm not even sure if I did it right. So I just did something.
Obviously, if it worked, you did.
Yeah. I see, actually, Inari, I see you have, I now see your comments.
No, that was not super important. I just got them
I
off.
see Winston has an answer for us. The numbering was constructed with other Bantu languages as base, and I think just coincidental that 12, 13 don't occur in Zulu. Aha, diminutive type class. Okay, thanks, Winston. That's very useful. And so I don't know, Inari, if you want to maybe ask one of your questions in the chat.
Oh, right. Yeah, they were just really random comments. Like for instance, like just, oh, okay, Casimir had a question. Let's go for that because I've been talking too much. Casimir.
When the Japanese grammar was first presented, or when I first listened to it, I had the feeling that it was all about fitting this language into the abstract syntax, and it didn't really fit in there. Well, it worked after all, but with a lot of difficulties. And when I listen to you, I have the same feeling that, well, some things we can do, some things really don't fit in the RGO syntax. So I was wondering how much of the difficulties that you face are due to that, and how much of this is due to the fact that, well, Zulu has not been really studied linguistically, and there are a lot of unknowns. Would it be better, for example, if there was Bantu RGO, for example, with specific abstract syntax and maybe better fitted to African languages or Bantu languages at least?
Yes. So I actually also thought about the Japanese. I can't remember at which summer school that there was a lady who worked on that. I think it's not as drastic as the Japanese. I think if I remember correctly, the Japanese had some pragmatic issues, like if depending on who you're talking to, I don't know, maybe it's the same thing. Yeah. So I think there might be. I've wondered about this, and we've spoken a lot about what should go in and what we don't want to lose. So the reason we don't just start from scratch with our own abstract syntax is because then, although it's useful for Zulu and maybe for the Bantu languages, we kind of lose an aspect of the multilinguality that we actually want to kind of, so that's very useful if you can help, if you can get these languages into that pool of things that are useful, that we want to kind of have as much as that as possible. So that's basically what our strategy has been, is implement everything in the resource grammar abstract syntax that does make sense, and extend it in ways that seem necessary. I see Arne has his hand up as well.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, because I think I once had a dream, and maybe it's a kind of a possible way to do, maybe even more linguistically pure than what we are doing now, is that one would actually build a resource grammar abstract syntax which is close to the language that you are studying, and then implement the standard resource grammar as an application of that. So there are some advantages. So one is that you can get, when you are parsing the language, you get a much kind of more adequate analysis of that language. It can also be more efficient to parse with, because you don't need to have so many parameters. But then, of course, you have some price to pay then in the when you you move the problems into another level, but maybe they can also be overcome in when you are then applying the resource grammar, because you never need to compile the middle resource grammar, so to say. But this is, of course, I mean, this is just a dream, because I think one should redo a lot of the old grammars in order to fit this model. But but it could. I'm thinking of that in, for instance, with Finnish as well, because there is a lot of spurious ambiguity coming from this fact, and some things get quite complicated because of that. It's and certainly for Chinese as well, that I have worked on a little bit. But it's well, it's both a dream and some kind of a theoretical linguistic project, and I'm not quite sure how practically interesting it would be. But just to mention.
Yes. Yeah. So one thing that I don't know. I am interested in the fact that there is a kind of, practically speaking, a universal grammar that we can somehow work towards, because my sense is that it could enlighten some aspects of Zulu, perhaps. So there's one way of just looking at the language and how it works and kind of having a model of that. But maybe you can actually have, if you take a slightly more ecumenical approach, this could perhaps lead to insights into Zulu itself. I don't know, it's a very half-baked thought, but I've wondered about this, because what does often happen is, so we generate kind of a what's the English word, kind of an edge case for Lionel to check, and then he says something we didn't expect, and then we ask him a question, and then it has often happened, and I have to emphasize that he's really one of the experts in Zulu, and especially the kind of linguist we want to work with, someone who's very formal and systematic in his approach. And he would often say, I've never thought about it that way. And so I've found that maybe we can shed some light on things in Zulu by approaching it from a more universal grammar kind of way. I don't know.
Yeah, makes sense.
Winston?
I actually think, Lorette, I was on the same. I mean, I haven't worked in GF so much, on this, but when I was working in XFST, I had the same sense exactly. There was a lot of stuff, doing the Xerox finite state, that just because we'd come from a totally computational linguistic, linguists hadn't thought of it in those structures before. So I think there is an element where the research is lacking in some way. Yeah.
And if I can re-emphasize my point of yesterday, it really starts with human resources. Like, there just aren't that many people working on these questions. So I think that's why, I don't know. Anyways. Check the chat.
Yeah, the chat is just off topic. Like, I don't need to discuss any of my remarks. It was just
okay.
Right. We have 2 more talks coming. How about, do we want to take like 5-minute break before the next? Maybe. I think this is not like this is not a formal conference. Like, I don't care if things go over time, because like we have 2 more talks for today, so not 10. So. Okay, so let's resume 8:10 Singapore time, whatever that is in your time zone. So go and stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee, tea, whatever. Good morning for all the newcomers from the American continent, and resume 10:10. Hi, there was an idea on the Discord that how about all the speakers would upload their slides on the GF Summer School repository. So then that's like, then it's not me who has to upload every single PDF onto the webpage. So that would be a way to disseminate the slides. So if you don't have the address, let me give you a link. Oh yeah, okay, it's 10 past already. So here's a link. So Folknet repository, put your slides under the appropriate day, and then
Yes,
make
yes.
Okay, perfect. And now
Okay.
it's 10 past. So let's start the next talk. So welcome, Daniel. We have a new face in GF community and a completely new language family. So let's hear about the.
Okay, people, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people in different time zones. Well, I've tried to share my desktop, but the presentation is not showing.
Yeah, I see the slide, but not in a presentation mode. Like.
Yes, something.
Does it help if you stop the share and then you start the presentation and then you share the screen that appears like this?
Okay.
Try that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, now that's the presentation.
So, the title of my presentation is GramYap, a GF grammar for a fragment of Nhangatu. I will present the results from a paper I've published this year on a Brazilian peer-reviewed journal. So, Nhangatu, maybe this language isn't well known, but it is a well-known language in Brazil, at least for people in linguistics. We have here the ISO code of the language. Alternative names are Língua Geral Amazônica, this Amazonian Língua Franca, or just Geral. Geral in Spanish, or modern Tupi. If you say that Nhangatu is modern Tupi, all Brazilians will know the language, but most Brazilians don't know the name, the designation Nhangatu, which is the preferred designation of the language nowadays, since about a century. Nhangatu is derived from 17th century Tupinambá, which is a variety of Tupi. Tupi is the indigenous language of Brazil. When the Portuguese came to Brazil about 600 years ago, there was 500 indigenous languages, but Tupi, with many of its varieties, was the most used and the most known language. There are nowadays about 6,000 speakers of Nhangatu, all in the municipality of São Gabriel da Cachoeira in Brazil, and about 80,000 in Colombia. The language status of Nhangatu is 6B in Brazil, 7 in Colombia, and 8 in Venezuela. 6B means that the language is threatened, but there are still children that learn the language. 7 means that the language is endangered. It means that children don't learn the language anymore. And 8 means nearly extinct. So São Gabriel da Cachoeira is one of the most isolated regions in Brazil. It is a municipality with everything modern life has to offer, but there are no roads to this town. No? I'm now in Fortaleza, and this is more than 3,000 kilometers distance from here. And if you can go there by boat or by flight, in boat or only by flight, but you come, maybe I can get to Singapore faster than to São Gabriel da Cachoeira. It's very complicated to get there. Okay. Why did I choose Nhangatu? First of all, we have the cultural and historical importance of the language. For more than 2 centuries, it was the most spoken language of the Amazonian region. It had more speakers. It was more widespread than Portuguese. Many many descendants of Europeans spoke Nhangatu and not Portuguese. And Nhangatu is more than Tupi. I mean, Tupi is very important in Brazilian culture. It had a great influence on Brazilian Portuguese. So if you learn Nhangatu, you can understand the names of many toponyms, there is names of places, and so on. And another important aspect is that Nhangatu has undergone a revitalization process in the last decade. There are literary translation to and from Nhangatu courses in different parts of Brazil to diverse target groups. So many people who are descendants of Europeans and don't have any relation to indigenous ethnicities learn Nhangatu because it's interesting, because it's important for Brazilian culture, because it has a rich literature and so on. You have here the example of one of these translations, this translation from Le Petit Prince, the Little Prince. This is a well-known book in Nhangatu, Muruxawa Mirim. Muruxawa Mirim. It was translated by Trevisan in his master. This is his master thesis work. No? Many people who are interested in Brazilian indigenous languages have the problem that the descriptions of these languages are not easily accessible. But in Nhangatu, you have very accessible and comprehensive descriptions, dictionaries, and course books. For example, these works cited here. Another reason which moved me to implement this grammar, this Nhangatu grammar, was the fact that it seems that there is no GF grammar for an Amerindian language. And Nhangatu is representative of Tupi, of the Tupi trunk, and more specifically of the Tupi-Guarani family. And Tupi is a linguistic trunk, a language trunk that is not related to any other language trunks in the world. So there are very interesting structural contrasts which represent a challenge for people trying to implement a multilingual grammar where one has to translate between the languages. For example, there's example, Maria Ruca Tistuaki. Maria's house is not near him. We have the picture shows the Nhangatu sentence, in the middle the Portuguese translation, and in the third column the English translation. In my English grammar, I didn't implement yet the Saxon genitive, only the Norman genitive. But we see that the structure of Nhangatu is very different, and this is a great challenge for the implementation. Another example, Kurumi Rendawa Petawa Ruaki. The boys' community is near your city. I'll go into details of these grammatical contrasts later. My goals with this implementation were multiple. First of all, I would like to better understand the language from a linguistic theoretic point of view. And this is relevant for language documentation. I think Nhangatu can survive, but there are previous historical stages of Nhangatu which are present in its literature. And the speakers nowadays can change the language so fast that the structure, the meaning of these literary texts don't become not more transparent from the point of view of present Nhangatu. So it is very important to document the language formally. And a way to do that is to implement this formalization, because you can test the formalization against data. You can check the formalization for internal consistency. And there is no formalization of Nhangatu. Even the doctoral dissertation by Aline Cruz, which has some formalization, has many gaps, as I show in my article. You have another goal was to provide computer-assisted language learning tools for people learning Nhangatu, for Nhangatu speakers learning Portuguese or English. The next reason or goal was machine translation between the three languages, English, Nhangatu, and Portuguese. And another goal was a personal one. I wanted to learn GF programming, and as my experience with other programming languages, I'm no computer science. I'm a formal linguist, and it was I have learned a lot GF programming by constructing this grammar. And it was also a way for me to learn Nhangatu. I'm no speaker of Nhangatu. Before engaging myself in this project, I have no idea about the structure of Nhangatu because my background in linguistics has more to do with German and so on, and in Portuguese. No? I will show some grammatical particularities of Nhangatu, which are very difficult to implement, at least for myself, but I have managed to implement these grammatical particularities. So I will list the particularities which were implemented. The first topic is linearization of qualifying predications. I started from Rante's Foods grammar, and in this domain of qualifying predication, you have interesting contrasts between English, Portuguese, and Nhangatu. Nhangatu is subject pro-drop, like Portuguese, but there is an interesting complication which I will show, which has to do with non-inflected stative verbs. We have a distinction in Nhangatu between uniform and multiform nouns, postposition, and verbs with very interesting morphology and many allomorphisms, which are dealt with in my grammar. And an interesting subject of Nhangatu grammar is and also from other Tupi languages, Tupi-Guarani languages, is the polyfunctionality of inactive prefixes, which can function as subject agreement markers, internal arguments of nouns, and postpositions. Abnormal possession is also very interesting from a contrastive linguistic point of view. Nhangatu is head marking. It's not dependent marking like English. We have a very interesting structural asymmetry between possessor and possessor. We have now some examples of sentences which can be parsed by my grammar and translated to English and Portuguese. Number 3, sentence number 3, Ayapuranga. If I just say Puranga, the sentence becomes ungrammatical because Puranga is a verb in Nhangatu. No? It is a stative or inactive verb, no? But this stative verb is not inflected. So if I just say Puranga, there is no marker of subject. So this is ungrammatical. Number 3, I can leave out the subject. Ae suri, or simply suri. Suri is a perfect sentence in Nhangatu, which means she is happy. She or he or it, né? Because there is no gender distinction in Nhangatu's pronominal system. But for simplification, I have translated all examples of ae as she. No? And number 5, ipuse, or ae ipuse. She is heavy. So we have here a distinction between between a uniform stative verb, puranga, and puse, and a multiform verb, which is suri, or ruri. And you have an allomorphy of the third person singular inative prefix. In 4, it is s. It's a syllabic variant. In 5, it is syllabic. But which allomorph one uses depends on the verb. Like Portuguese and Spanish, Nhangatu has a lexicalization of the distinction between individual level predication and stage level predication. To express individual level predication, you just don't use any copula. That food is very expensive. Nha'an timbiu sepiasuretana. There is no copulative verb. There is, the verb is sepiasu. This is a non-inflected stative verb. But it means that the property of being expensive is a permanent one. But if you want to express that this is a transitory property, one uses in Nhangatu an auxiliary verb. So, Nha'an timbiu sepiasu retana uiku. Uiku. Uiku is the auxiliary which express the progressive. Yeah, but maybe this abbreviation, I use it for encoding this transitory property was not very adequate, but because in Portuguese, I just use the verb estar. For people who know Spanish, we have a distinction between ser and estar. That food is very expensive, but this is a transitory property. We have more examples. In this case here, we have the verb saku, which means hot. The milk is hot, or milk is hot. And in sentence 9, we have the stage level variety with the auxiliary uiku. Like Latin, Nhangatu doesn't have any definite article, so you can translate a sentence, a noun phrase without an article, without a definite article. With no article at all, you can translate with both the indefinite or the definite article. So we have some examples of translations. In English, the milk is hot. We have two translations in Nhangatu and two translations in Portuguese, because we have this distinction in Nhangatu and Portuguese between stage level and individual level predication. We have here examples of a multiform noun. We see that the word translating community in the examples has three forms. Ta kunhai ta rendawa suaki. Their women's community is near him. We have the form of the noun is rendawa with the relationalizer prefix. This means that the word is in a possessive construction, is the possession of a possessive construction. Sendawa uiku taruaki. His community is near them. So in this case, the form sendawa is the possessor prefix. And tendawa tataruri, the translation didn't appear. The meaning is the community is the communities are happy. The communities are happy. So tendawa itadas is the so-called tendawa with T, with the prefix T, this is the so-called absolute form. This means that the word is not in a possessive construction. So there is a very strong contrast in the possessive constructions of English, Portuguese, and Nhangatu. Because in Nhangatu, the possessor is a noun phrase, but the possession is a determiner phrase. So you can't many examples of possessive constructions in Portuguese and English can't be translated with the Nhangatu genitive. Maybe there is a way to translate these constructions by means of a paraphrase, but I so far I'm not aware of this possibility. I would like to someday meet Nhangatu speakers and ask them, or Nhangatu teachers. In Nhangatu, there is a systematic ambiguity between an argument denoting and a classificatory reading in the genitive construction. For example, qua igara rangawa. There are two translations to this sentence. This picture of the canoe, in this case, the canoe is a participant in the situation. But the genitive, the genitive can be translated just as this canoe picture. Canoe is not a participant in the situation. It has a role which is similar to an adjective. The asymmetry makes the translation of some sentences in English, as I said, impossible with the genitive construction in Nhangatu. For example, that boy's canoe. because that boy is a DP, but the possessor in Nyenga 2 must be a NP. So I will detail now the implementation. When, as everybody knows, one can choose two paths when implementing a grammar in GF. When you can use a synthetically based abstract syntax, for example, Nyaan timbiu sepiasu retana. That food is very expensive. I can model an abstract syntax which abstracts away from linearization differences between the different languages, and this modeling would be something like this tiny CFG grammar. You have a sentence which is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and the verb phrase is a verb and an adjectival phrase. But the problem with this approach is that we have no adjective phrase in Nyenga 2 in these examples. We have a verb, sepiasu. This is a verb in Nyenga 2. In this case, this is a non-inflected stative verb, but in many cases we have an inflected stative verb. So I just to find out how far I could go with this toy grammar from Renta 2011, I've chosen the second path, as a semantically based abstract syntax. And for all people who have learned GF, this is very well known, the foods grammar. You have a predication function which constructs a comment from an item and a quality. So I successively changed this starter grammar from Renta and to handle the grammatical phenomena which are very contrastive, and the result was this modeling, this cognitive semantic modeling of sentence structure in Nyenga 2. The breadth function is now more complicated because to construct a comment, I join, I use a polarity, an item, and a state. And state is built from a property, and a property can be built from a location or a quality. Because in the set of grammatical phenomena, I decided to implement. There were postpositions. Postpositions are very interesting, and so I need to model locations as a kind of property. So we have here two parse trees for the example. Nyaan timbiu sepiasu retana, as in Nyenga 2, and that food is very expensive in English. And I had to construct many different types for entities, because in order to avoid overgeneration, I had to construct types for non-datic noun phrases, for example. And datic noun phrases are phrases whose heads are pronouns. And this entity domain in my grammar is very complicated. I can't show the details here, but the grammar is freely accessible. People can download the code. Unfortunately, the article is in Portuguese, but maybe Google Translator can make sense of the Portuguese text. And so, we have here the functions that are used to build this sentence. And another example, Kwa Igara Rangawa. This picture of the canoe. I have the type that in order to avoid overgeneration, I had to create some types to restrict which kind of structure appears as possessor. Because as I said, you can't translate that boy's canoe into Nhangatu using the genitive construction, because that boy is a determiner phrase. And in Nhangatu, the possessor is a noun phrase. So you can't have any demonstratives, quantifiers, modifying the possessor head. So the function make possessor uses a number and a simple kind. I have a distinction between simple kind and post kind. This is all these types were created to avoid overgeneration, to get only grammatical output in Nhangatu. And to get the right translation, because I need to encode the number, plural or singular, in order to get the right translation. So I will show some examples of ambiguity. We have the ambiguity of the English sentence in relation to the distinction between stage level and individual level for education. Nyai ta apigawa igara yuku paranau pe. We have here an example with a postposition. So I will show now some evaluation data. The grammar, the Nhangatu grammar was evaluated with a positive test set with 140 sentences. All sentences translated into Portuguese and English. And we have a negative test set with 100 71 ungrammatical sentences, and only 2 ungrammatical sentences were analyzed. So there is a need to correct something in the grammar to avoid this overgeneration. This graph shows the ambiguity of the grammar. We see that more than about half the examples have just one parse, né? And only 3% of the sentences have more 12 parses. Né? Ambiguity arises mostly from my decision to model it, she, and he as distinct types, né? In the semantic, in the abstract syntax. So we have here some selected references. The first one is my paper, which appeared this year in February. Cruz is the doctoral dissertation, which was carried out in Holland by Aline Cruz. Information about the present situation of Nhangatu can be found on the Ethnologue site. The course book I used is by Navarro, né? Curso de Língua Geral, Nhangatu course. This is very good to learn Nhangatu. This is a traditional language course book with lessons, dialogues, texts, and grammatical exercises, and so on. Next steps. Né? I would like to thank Inari for her suggestions, which she sent to me by email. And the most important suggestion is to implement the Nhangatu grammar as a resource grammar. She made a first version of the Nhangatu grammar. Unfortunately, I was very involved on another project. I couldn't dive into this version of the grammar. I must postpone the further development of the Nhangatu grammar after I conclude the present project I'm involved in, which is the development of a HPSG grammar for Portuguese, in collaboration with my colleague Alexandre Rademacher, which will speak about this project tomorrow. So I think I'm very curious how far I can get with this cognitive semantic modeling. So I think the next step will be to further develop this approach to include other phenomena of Nhangatu. But I'm very curious also if it is possible to get the right translations in Nhangatu using the resource grammar approach. My grammar will always, if I choose the semantic grammar approach, my grammar will generate English translation. So, and this translation can be used to translate, for example, from Nhangatu to Japanese, for example. So this was my presentation. The grammar is on GitHub. E Kwekatu Rete, muito obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you. Do people have any questions? Yes, Arne, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. Very fascinating talk. And this reminds me of something that I started to think about when listening to Laurette about Zulu, which is that maybe it's a good approach to start with a more native resource grammar. That's one thing, because then you can get it kind of more closer to the language and simpler to get started with. The other thing is that actually I think that it is in some sense more feasible to share an abstract syntax for a semantic grammar than for the resource grammar, because we can be kind of sure that the semantic things can be expressed in different languages because they can be translated to each other, but it is not clear that the syntactic structures can be mapped to a common core. So in that sense, I think the RGL abstract syntax has been a hypothesis all the time. So how far can we go with this? And there are some limits, and we are touching them here, and that's quite interesting. And I think so one should after all see GF as something more general than the RGL, and this is what you have been doing here. So yeah, I'm very very impressed by this work.
Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Ariana? Yeah, so sorry, just go ahead and answer. I was just, Ariana, you can just, you maybe you don't need me to tell you when to speak, so I can just, take your whatever. Leonard, you can answer, and then Ariana, you can say anything.
Yeah, it's not a question. I just wanted to say thank you for this. It was very fascinating and also inspiring that you're doing it with an endangered language. It was really, really fascinating to hear. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your attention and your comment.
So I tried to check if there is any Wikipedia pages written in this language, and if we could. I didn't find that yet. At least I just tried to make it. There was a Wikipedia article about the language, but not in the language.
Yes.
So yeah.
No. There is a lot to be done about Nhangatu, because this group, there is a very good group in São Paulo, at the University of São Paulo. Professor Navarro and his students, they have done a wonderful job in translating classics of universal literature, of Brazilian literature into Nhangatu, and also Nhangatu literature into different languages. For example, there are Nhangatu tales translated into Russian, for example. It's a very fascinating work. But they have this bias, which is a good thing, because in order to survive, people have to have interesting reading materials in Nhangatu. So thanks to this work, Nhangatu learners and speakers can now read The Little Prince, for example, and other important works of universal literature. But there is no work in this more trivial domain of Nhangatu pages, né? It would be, it's a pity, né, that you don't have at least the description of the language in the language, no?
Yeah, so I think one could get started without having the RGL. I mean, you don't, when you have the RGL, it helps, but you can also see the NLG as a semantic grammar by itself, and you can implement it by itself and get started. So that would be an interesting project for you or for someone.
Yes, maybe
Yes.
When my grammar is able to translate something other than this qualifying predication domain, I'll think about translating something and put it in Wikipedia. This is a very great idea.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is that in your foods-inspired grammar, there are no verbs, it's just predication. But Herbert and then Laurette.
Sorry?
Thanks for your talk. And so you mentioned in the beginning that you're interested in computer-assisted language learning. And I'm curious if you have any concrete plans to work on that, maybe even in connection with GF.
Yes, I mentioned computer-assisted language learning because GF already has a tool that makes a query. No? If you have a multilingual grammar, you can start an exercise, a translation exercise, where sentences are presented to the user in Nhangatu, and one has to translate into English or Portuguese. And there is also the possibility to make a query in the domain of inflection, to conjugate verb or make the plural or of nouns and so on.
Yeah, so there has been quite a bit of work on computer-assisted language learning in GF. There is, on the one hand, the rather simple quizzes, but there has also been a bit more extensive work on translation exercises.
Yes, great.
But basically, as soon as you have multilingual grammars, then you can do a lot about it.
Yes, thank you.
And I think it's particularly good for under-resourced languages. So I'm very happy about your work.
Yes, thank you for your comment.
Okay. Laurette.
Thank you very much. That I think, as everyone has said, that they share the excitement about working on languages with few resources, and especially endangered languages. So, thank you very much. I have a question about standardization in the language. Are there efforts to standardize? Has it been in some way standardized? And have you thought about the impact that a computational grammar might have on standardizing aspects of the language?
Unfortunately, people in the Nhangatu community are not very interested in creating a single standard for the language. Different groups use different orthographies. It's complicated, no? For example, the people of this group in São Paulo use an orthography. People in São José da Cachoeira use a different orthography, and so on. No? Maybe the people should because there is a prejudice against standardization. No? People think that standardization is something that is politically not good, but I don't think so. It would be very nice to have a single standard because the language is small. There is, if there are so many orthographies, it will be very complicated for the development of the language, for the survival. So I hope that I have some ideas about this on my paper. I recommend that the people standardize the language, because there are also old texts, one century old texts. So it's important that people use the language like they use, but it's important to learn this standard which is present on old texts. So if one disregard these old texts, which which makes an interesting and rich literary corpus, will these texts won't be more people won't understand this anymore if there is no learning of the standard language.
Thank you. Yeah, we have had, well, I think this happens to many languages that are where the speakers, or at least there hasn't been some standardization. So a computational grammar always, I think, has some effect on that. So if it's a good thing for the language in question, then I think that's also somehow an argument to keep on implementing these grammars. So.
Yes. The implementation is a means to test the description of the grammar. If the formalization of the rules are correct, if there are any gaps. Okay, it makes no sense to teach people a formalized grammar, but the formalized grammar represents a good basis to formulate pedagogical grammars, because the formalized grammar is completely explicit and was tested against these contradictions which you find in informal descriptions.
I agree. Yes.
And there are many details which I couldn't show, but my formalization has raised interesting questions about GP structure in Yenga 2, for example, I don't know from the description, I couldn't infer neither from the examples, nor from the descriptions, how deeply recursive a noun phrase can be, or a determiner phrase. How many possessors are possible? No? For example, I don't know if one can translate the boys, cats, ball, the boy. Yeah? A possessor construction with many possessor embedded, no? Because so at least to raise hypotheses, the formalization is very good, because when you write the grammar generates sentences which were not present in the corpus, but which are but which can be possible, grammatical.
Yeah, so a quick comment from me before Ariana's question. Just like, yeah, that's markedly different approach from GF. It's like you can just in the RGL you can apply post MP as many times as possible, but like arbitrarily many times. But like with the knowledge that definitely like not all the trees that RGL produces are grammatical, and that's like just a part of the deal. Like it's everyone accepts it. Whereas your grammar, you actually try to like you had a negative test, so like that's nothing I've ever done myself, because it's just like I want to create a set of trees of which some like which contains all the trees that I care about, and then I just don't care about the rest. Sorry for hijacking this. Ariana's comment. Go ahead.
Yes, but it was very important for me to test my modeling for correctness, because I had this idea of formalizing the language so that correct formulation of rules for language learners would be possible. So this was my context. But I understand that in other contexts it's not necessary to check for overgeneration, but for me it was very important. So that I say my grammar is a good model of Nyengato structure. Nyengato, the possessor construction is so and so, and not you can predict which sentences are not correct, because for learners this is very important, because if the learner writes a sentence which is not correct, the program will at least show that the grammar is wrong. So this is the reason why it was so important for me to check for overgeneration. Sorry if I interrupted someone.
No problem. I was curious, relation to Lorette's question. If you say that there's that there's not enough standardization when it comes to this language, how did your evaluation go? So did you choose a particular, standard, or some particular norms, or how did it work?
Yes, also the main descriptions of the language are different, because Aline Cruz, the dissertation of Aline Cruz, the doctoral dissertation of Aline Cruz, is a description of spoken Nyengato in different communities in the region where Nyengato is spoken. And Navarro makes an effort towards standardization, because he is interested in this literary heritage of Nyengato, which represents a standard. So when there were doubts, I've chosen Navarro's opinion.
Thank you.
Because there are dialects in Nyengato, but Navarro makes already a good effort towards grammar standardization, because he bases his description on this literary tradition.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
A minor announcement: our next speaker has not arrived. I have emailed her and no answer, so I don't know if she marked the wrong date in her calendar, or wrong time with the time zones. But I don't know. We can keep, so if people want to talk more about anything related to these 2 talks, we can do it. And, you know, if you're also feel free to just drop off if you want to. But I would like to I have like a very generic comment on, like, I mean, something that was touched briefly in both yours and Laurette's talk, which is like, one of my pet peeves is like people say that, oh, RGL is bad because in my language, adjectives are verbs. And my answer to that is just like, okay, so, well, then make the linkage of A and B the same, and make the attributive, like you can put a relative clause or whatever, you can put a thing there. Like, that's, that might not be feasible.
Yes.
I guess like in Laurette's case, like the Zulu case, like if there is actually some closed class of adjectives, like then maybe the category becomes a bit complex because it's like a union of the actual closed class adjectives and verbs. So maybe in that case, it makes more sense to have just one category for this closed class and other for verbs. But like I have implemented resource grammars for languages where adjectives are verbs, and that's like exactly what I've done. So that's my
yes. I would like to try this idea, no? Whether it is how it looks like, no? to have a synthetically based abstract syntax for both Ngatu, Portuguese, and English.
Yeah, Laurette, you were saying, yeah.
Yes, so that is interesting. I think it can break everything very quickly, or at least that's been our experience, because the verb morphology for Zulu is pretty complex, and that's the bottleneck in the grammar. And so if you not only have verbs as verbs, but also adjectives as verbs, things get a bit insane. So I think it's in principle you could do that. So I agree in a way, but I think it starts making, so there are 2 things. I think the one is the linguistic description becomes a bit muddled. So people looking at a syntax tree have no idea what's going on, because where they expected an adjective, they find a verb, or they expected a verb and now it's an adjective. And also you double implement things, which has an effect on the feasibility of the grammar. It just stops compiling. You had one comment in earlier that you asked, can't we just uncomment the problematic functions when we compile test things? That's okay, except that the problematic function is spread-vp. So difficult to uncomment that and still have something useful to work on. So yeah. I think what I have found is that there are many ways to skin a cat, and you have to find solutions that kind of do what, have fulfill the purpose that you want this grammar to address. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. And like, yeah, I mean, especially in your case when the verb morphology is so complex, and that category would be some type, basically. Like I'm talking about Korean, which has much simpler verb morphology. So that makes much more sense to have things like my point is just that as long as you have something that can work as a predicative and something that can work as an attribute, then you can just shove it in the AP and that's it. But of course, yeah, in other languages, it could be more complicated. And as right as you said, Laurette, like you can always derive an attributive from a verb via rel CL, and then you can use the rel CN function to modify a CN. So you totally achieve what you want without just having adjective just be this close class. So that's perfectly fine in your case. But yeah, sorry about this random digression. I think like if our speaker is 20 minutes late and doesn't answer email, I think we can say that we have waited for her. So like I'm fine with ending this session with these 2 talks. Any other comments? Anyone else?
I have a question for you, Inari,
Oh,
related to the RGL that has just, if a tree doesn't make sense, it generates nonsense. So we looked a bit at GFTest,
yeah.
but maybe we should have looked a bit more. My question is, we found that giving examples to a linguist, that there's a line that it crosses where the cognitive load of trying to figure out whether the sentence is syntactically correct, given the fact that the semantics is broken, becomes too much. And it's difficult to say, you know, look at this, but ignore these kinds of errors. You understand what I'm saying? So are there plans maybe to inform GFTest semantically in some way? Have we just missed that? Honestly, we haven't had time to look in more detail. And I think this does touch on the ambiguity versus overgeneration kind of issue.
Yeah, so GFTest has had no development since like in 3 years, basically. So the answer is no. I think like actually once we have this new Majestic runtime, I suppose that we need to rewrite GFTest as well. When I say we, I just mean like someone. So that might be, yeah, Casimir? Did you have a comment? Okay, so like, okay, so to answer your actual question, you can use GFTest with an application grammar. So like when I remember when I was like developing GFTest and I was using my supervisor to like look at test sentences, I commented out, for instance, some verbs like vomit, because it would just love to put that verb everywhere and like but yeah, like an application. So if you use an application grammar and then you use the Breeze's grammar in an application grammar and then you generate tests from that, that's could be a thing. But obviously it's incomplete because it's the full Breeze's grammar is much bigger. So yeah, I totally agree. Like it's definitely not easy to say that, okay, ignore this kind of errors because it's so completely wildly weird.
Yes, so we haven't actually, the one thing that we should look at still is these negative tests, and we don't know how they should look at the moment. I think semantics would go some way towards at least focusing the testing, but yeah, I just thought
I just think that I kind of disagree because maybe like, I don't know, maybe like Arne, whoever designed the abstract syntax of the RGL like 20 whatever years ago, maybe you were thinking back then that, okay, of course, all of this will make sense. But then once it expands to 40 languages, like there is certainly things that just don't make sense. So like, okay, the alternatives that you don't, okay, if it's a lexical thing, like if it's a no quant, then you just don't implement no quant and that's it. So then it doesn't creep up and do things. But if it's like this thing kind of like where you have the old predet and you get this all those stadiums, whatever, and that's fine in one context, but that's not fine in another context. Like I think it's too much to ask from the purpose of the RGL to make sure that like you don't generate, because it's compositional. It's not like you can just say that. I mean, you can with the non-exist, like you can always use this like Mihal's plausibility filtering, but that will just totally blow up RGL, and that's not what it's for. So
yeah, so I think maybe what I mean is there are some things that we want to exclude. And then there are other things that so it's about, but we try to think a bit about, you know, whose responsibility is this? And in the end, we kind of settled on if the tree doesn't make sense, there's no telling if the linearization will make sense. So if someone doesn't know that you can't use this function with that kind of noun, then we can't help them, basically. And this is also kind of supported from a parsing perspective, I think, because hopefully you won't have nonsense Zulu sentences in a corpus. So if you have parsed them, we want to be able to trust the parser to some extent. And then hopefully the trees that you have make sense because they were found by looking at real Zulu. But yeah, finding a line between this is your problem, you have a bad syntax tree, and having the grammar do something useful on all trees. It's difficult.
Arne, your comment?
Yeah, this is a bit puzzling or interesting. So I think the core RGL abstract syntax was meant to be some kind of an intersection of what can be found in languages. And it has worked surprisingly well. I wouldn't even have believed that it can be implemented so well. But the resource grammar for each language, I always thought that it's actually the core plus the language specific extensions, because the core itself is not sufficient for any of the languages that we have worked with. But then there is, of course, the dual of it. So actually, maybe the language doesn't have everything in the core. And that's, of course, possible by using non-exist and so on. But the price to pay is that it becomes more difficult to use the RGL and especially its API. But maybe that's just a technical problem, so it could be solved by some technical work and some documentation. I'm not sure. At the same time, I think that it's and this has I have also heard these comments that even if the common abstract syntax is can be troublesome to implement, so it's a good guidance when you, so it's much easier than starting from scratch because you know what you are looking for. So it's a kind of a form to fill rather than that you think freely from the beginning. So
yes, I would agree with that. That's definitely, you can start with a textbook on the grammar and go from there, but it has been useful to focus some specific questions. So 100% agree. I think maybe this is also a question of degree. So as soon as a quarter of you have, maybe, I don't know, we're still figuring this out for Zulu, but maybe 30% of the functions, whatever that might mean in the core, doesn't exist in Zulu, maybe. Or if it's 3%, that's one kind of problem. If it's half, then that's a different kind of problem. So yeah, I think it will be interesting to see, for us, at least for ourselves, how much of the core we can implement without putting too much strain on the grammar, and then maybe go from there. I like the idea, I think, I can't remember who mentioned it, of considering sub abstract syntaxes. So for a Bantu abstract syntax, but then even then, as soon as you diverge too much, you lose that very usefulness of the RGL for all the languages. So I don't know. Yeah,
the RGL has become such an important part of the ecosystem, and it was very strongly shown in for instance, Krasimir's talks today and yesterday, which is, yeah, so much comes with it when you are sticking to that. So it's,
I just wanted to ask that you mentioned that the RGO is the intersection, but it was maybe the intersection of n number of languages in the beginning. And now there are so many more languages. So if you actually make a real intersection of all the languages, then the RGO will become even smaller. So then, by definition, the RGO will keep decreasing if we make intersection. I sometimes want to have more of an union. For example, in extent we have this you pronoun in feminine or I feminine pronoun, something like this, which of course doesn't make sense for some languages, but it makes for a lot of languages. So why not having this in the core, and then if the language doesn't support it, then you just implement it as one and the same words. Sometimes this makes sense, sometimes it's too much, but I think the balance should be somewhere.
Yeah, no, I think the easiest place to put the balance now is in the current abstract syntax, because any other solutions would require a lot of work. So, but who knows?
Well, some things are easier. It's not very hard to just define you feminine in all languages as equal to something that is the default.
Yeah, no,
Some
yeah,
other generalizations take more time. Someone have to go through I don't know how many languages and fix things.
Yeah,
it's
if we-
also sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying if we do that, then we should add all of that to the API as well, because like we have the extend and we have the extend function that is already doing that, but that's like we can't give any guarantees, because yeah, if we implement you fem pronoun as you mask pronoun, we don't know if that's correct, and I guess we're assuming that the API would be correct, but extend might be incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Oh yes, that's also true.
I would also say, sorry, yeah. Yeah, just
No, please go ahead.
yeah. So I think I would like to promise everyone that we are not going to change the API, because there is so much code that depends on it working. So
Not change, but extend.
but the extent, the changes will be in the extent and in some other non-core modules. So
yeah, but I mean, if we just literally add a new pronoun in the API, that doesn't change anything in the old. That's
yeah, so that's you can always. I think it's always possible to extend the API but not shrink it. So that's the only direction where we can go. Although there is also, well, but that I think is in everywhere. So if you extend the API with some function which has some new name, then there is a risk of breaking backward compatibility, because someone's own application might have a function with that name, and then the compilation fails suddenly. But it's very hard to guard against that except by using qualified imports.
I admit we haven't looked at the extend module yet. So we kind of assume that everything that we implement as extend might be in there or not. But how does it work? Is there an extend for different? Is it just one module? Would it make sense perhaps to have an extend Bantu and an extend Romance, or I don't know. I guess that there are some solutions to that already. But so like you said, the bias should be towards the languages that are in there now, but hopefully we'll have quite a few Bantu languages in a few years. So yeah.
That's what we have been doing previously with this extra modules. So there is extra Finnish, extra Romance, and extra French, and so on. But then it turned out that it's can be better to have a union of all the extensions, right? So that you can keep translating. Yeah. But I don't know. There are pros and cons.
Yeah, so the specific feature I'm thinking about for the Bantu languages is there are pronouns for all the noun classes. So you would have, at the moment, we just add them as we need them, but they are, it's not just masculine and feminine, it's, 18 of them, 16 of them.
Yes.
which brings the other problem that I faced with the WordNet, that I cannot just put it somewhere. It should be, the pronoun should be a function of a noun, like a make pronoun, which takes a noun and returns a pronoun. This would scale much better, and it will cover your case where you have a number of cases, a number of genders. The problem then is that in parsing, you have no way to fill in this noun. And that's why I don't like it yet, but sounds like it's still in the right direction. But instead of the noun, there should be something like the bound variables in the abstract syntax, which can carry information from one place in the abstract syntax to another. But it's not exactly working in this way.
Yes, so I noticed that so when generating the referring expressions in NLG yesterday, so then I was using an application grammar function that takes an NP as its argument and creates a pronoun. But then I found that it was not really adequate RGL support for that, so I had to add something in those languages, or otherwise one should use the very low-level resource res modules to find the gender and number of a noun phrase. That was but that's at least when you are doing generation, so then it's okay to do in this way, because, but if you used it for parsing, then you would get these question marks.
Yeah, the alternative is to just choose a number of nouns like man, woman, and animal or something else, and then each of these nouns will represent the gender, and the parser knows, okay, I should put this noun.
Yeah.
Or maybe some non-nouns, empty nouns that leave no trace. They just leave the empty string, but they have all the agreement, and you know you've now parsed some generic noun. It's just an entry in the lexicon. I don't know, but then maybe that'll break the morphology. I don't know.
Can we put all the different gender forms as variants in one it pron? Like, I mean, for parsing purposes, like not for generation. Like if we put variants in one lexical item and not in a syntactic function.
Oh, you could, but then when you translate, what should you do? It will become she maybe in some language. And if you had a noun, if, for example, if I have sheep, then in English I say it, in Bulgarian I say she. And it's the noun that determines.
Yeah. You know, I think the kind of the final truth is with what Frederick showed yesterday, that you have to look at the referent of the pronoun and use some semantic clues, whatever, when you are interpreting a pronoun. So that's in the end, you can't escape that if you want to translate the text correctly.
Well, thanks for the conversation. This has been a very nice RGL theme, basically. And so I think after 40 minutes, if someone's 40 minutes late, probably they're not coming. So how about we can wrap this up and go to sleep or start our day, or
Yeah.
Thanks for today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Tomorrow we have GF and Friends, different grammar formulas.